The morning was gray and cold when Rachel Carter returned to her Boston apartment. Her boots still damp from the long, classified debriefing in Maine. She hadn't planned on checking her personal tablet. She rarely did. Her life was too compartmentalized for casual browsing. But as she set down her encrypted duffel and finally powered it on, the glow of the screen confronted her with something she hadn't expected: a wedding photo. In it, her younger sister, Anna Carter, spun beneath a canopy of string lights, her ivory dress flowing around her like a cloud. She was smiling, radiant, twirling in the arms of a man Rachel didn't even recognize. The caption beneath read simply, "She said yes." For a moment, Rachel thought it was some kind of mistake, a friend's celebration that the algorithm had mistakenly linked to her. But no, the tags were clear. Anna Carter, Matthew Halpern, her sister's engagement, her sister's wedding. Rachel scrolled through the other images. Ring shots, vineyard landscapes, laughing groups of family and friends. She wasn't in a single one. Of course she wasn't. She hadn't even known Anna was engaged. A bitter laugh slipped out, sharp and humorless. She shouldn't have been surprised. Still, the realization cut deeper than she expected. Years of silence, of being the ghost in her own family's story. And now this. A wedding without a word, without an invitation, without acknowledgement that she even existed. Her hands tightened around the tablet. She had risked her life in places her family would never see, carried burdens they'd never understand. Yet here she was, erased from the only family photo album that should have included her. Rachel Carter, 32 years old, former Major General, decorated intelligence officer, reduced to a stranger at her sister's wedding, finding out not by phone, not by letter, but by accident. The hidden bride was Anna. The forgotten sister was Rachel. A knock at the door startled Rachel out of her thoughts. She crossed the room quickly, half expecting it to be a neighbor or another courier from the agency. But the man was already walking away, leaving a single white envelope on the floor. Heavy, cream-colored, with her family's name embossed across the front in cursive silver. The Carter family. Not Rachel. Not even Ms. Rachel Carter. Just a collective label, impersonal, as though the invitation had been an afterthought. She carried it back to the kitchen, her fingers brushing over the expensive paper stock. For a heartbeat, her chest tightened with something almost like hope. Perhaps Anna had sent it herself. Perhaps she'd scribbled a note inside, a private acknowledgement that despite the silence, despite everything, Rachel was still her sister. But when she slit the envelope open, the contents betrayed her. Inside was a perfectly printed card. Elegant, embossed, flawless. Anna Carter and Matthew Halpern cordially invite you to their wedding celebration at the Elms Estate, New York. November 4th. That was all. No personal message, no "I hope you'll come." Not even a signature. Just a QR code to scan for attendance. Rachel stood at the counter, staring at it for a long while. Her pulse was steady, but her breath came shallow. It felt less like an invitation and more like a summons. A seat filler added at the last minute, a name tacked on so no one could say she hadn't been asked. The tablet buzzed with an incoming text. Her mother. Margaret's message was brief, stripped of warmth. "If you come, please wear beige or gray." Nothing loud. No greeting. No acknowledgement of whether she'd received the envelope. Just instructions. Like Rachel was an unruly guest at someone else's party, a liability to be managed rather than a daughter to be welcomed. Rachel set the invitation flat on the counter, pressing her palm against the thick paper until the edges bent. She didn't know if she was angry, sad, or simply tired. She only knew that whatever this was, it wasn't family. The cold invitation sat between her and the past, daring her to decide whether to accept her place on the margins, or to walk straight back into the life that had tried to erase her. The invitation lay on Rachel's nightstand like an accusation, its cream edges stark against the dark wood. She had tried to ignore it, but every time she passed, her eyes betrayed her, flicking back to the embossed names, to the date she hadn't been meant to know. Her tablet buzzed again, this time a voice call. The name on the screen gave her pause. Natasha Byrne. It had been months since they'd spoken, But Natasha had a way of appearing when silence grew too heavy. Rachel answered, leaning back against the headboard. Nat. Static cracked through the line before her friend's voice settled. You saw it. Rachel closed her eyes. The photos. Yeah. Natasha's tone was careful, practiced. Are you okay? Rachel let out a dry laugh, one without humor. Define okay. I found out my sister got married from a stranger's Instagram. My parents couldn't even text. And then, when the invitation finally came, it wasn't addressed to me. Just the Carter family. Natasha was silent for a moment, then said softly, Don't go. Rachel opened her eyes, staring at the ceiling. Why not? Because it'll hurt more than it heals. You know what they're like. They've already written you out. Showing up will just make you bleed for nothing. The words landed heavy, but Rachel didn't flinch. She had known Natasha would say this. Practical, protective as always. Still, something inside her resisted. I think I have to, she said finally. Rachel. No, Rachel's voice was firm now. Not for them. Not because I expect kindness or reconciliation. But because being erased is worse than being unwanted. If I don't show up, it's like I agreed with them. Like I don't exist. Silence stretched again. Natasha sighed. You're still carrying the old wounds, aren't you? They never healed, Rachel admitted. They just stopped bleeding where anyone could see. On the other end, Natasha said nothing more. She didn't need to. Rachel knew she understood. But the warning lingered in the static between them. The wedding wasn't just a celebration. It was a battlefield. And Rachel was already stepping onto it. The road into the Hudson Valley twisted through crimson trees and misty ridges, autumn spilling its colors across the hills like paint from an overturned jar. Rachel kept her hands tight on the steering wheel, the rental car humming steadily beneath her. The long drive had been silent except for the occasional crackle of a news station she couldn't bear to listen to. By the time she reached the wrought iron gates of the Elms estate, the sky had softened to a watercolor gray. The mansion rose out of the trees like something from an old novel. Ivy climbing stone walls, gold-tinged windows, sweeping lawns carefully trimmed. It was the kind of place her mother would choose. Grand, tasteful, expensive enough to impress, but not gaudy enough to invite ridicule. Other guests arrived in clusters, their laughter carrying across the gravel as they stepped from polished sedans and black limousines. Women in jewel-toned cocktail dresses, men in tailored suits, name tags already pinned to their lapels. The staff welcomed them with rehearsed smiles and trays of champagne. Rachel parked at the far edge of the loop and sat for a moment, watching through the windshield. She could have turned around then, driven back down the winding road, pretended none of this had reached her. But she didn't. Instead, she straightened her slate gray jacket, the subdued color her mother had demanded, and stepped out. Inside, the check-in table gleamed beneath a chandelier. Two young women with earpieces tapped briskly on silver iPads, greeting each new arrival with polished warmth. Rachel approached silently, her boots muffled against the carpet. Name? One of them asked, not looking up. Rachel Carter. The woman's fingers paused, then scrolled. Her brow furrowed. I don't see. Rachel Carter. She glanced at her colleague, typing faster now. Are you perhaps with the Halpern family? Rachel's jaw tightened. No. I'm the bride's sister. That earned her a quick look. Half recognition, half embarrassment. After a tense beat, the woman forced a smile and murmured, Please wait a moment. Within seconds, a supervisor appeared, smoothing over the awkwardness with a polished gesture. This way, Ms. Carter. No explanation, no apology. Just efficient redirection. She was led past the grand reception area, past the gilded chairs reserved for real family, into a small alcove near the exit. A neat sign labeled it overflow seating. The chairs were plain, the view partial. From here, she could hear the music, see the lights, but she was meant to remain invisible. Rachel lowered herself into the seat, her jacket pressed neatly across her lap. Around her, strangers murmured and laughed, sipping champagne, glancing past her as though she weren't there at all. It wasn't exile. It was worse. It was erasure. Rachel sat quietly in her overflow seat, the hum of voices around her carrying the polished cheer of people who belonged. She didn't lift her glass of champagne. She didn't smile at the photographs arranged along the walls, all curated moments of family milestones. Vacations, birthdays, graduations. Not one included her. The air shifted when Margaret Carter entered. Her mother moved with the poise of someone who thrived under scrutiny. Cream suit, pearls perfectly aligned, her hair pinned into a flawless twist. Two women from her bridge club flanked her like attendants. Margaret's eyes swept the room, brushing over Rachel before settling reluctantly on her face. "Rachel," she said at last, crossing the space with measured grace. Her tone was polite but not warm, like she was greeting an acquaintance she'd been obliged to invite. "You came." "I did." Margaret's gaze flicked down, appraising the muted jacket, the simple dress beneath. Her mouth softened into something almost resembling a smile. "Thank you for dressing appropriately." No hug. No welcome. Just assessment. Checking whether her eldest daughter would embarrass her in front of the vineyard crowd. Minutes later, Arthur Carter arrived. His stride purposeful as he exchanged words with one of the groomsmen. His eyes caught Rachel mid-conversation. For the briefest moment, his step faltered. Then he gave her a curt nod and turned back to the groom's party as though she were furniture, something to be acknowledged in passing but never addressed. Rachel lowered her eyes, her hand folding tighter over the program in her lap. Family, she thought, was supposed to mean something more than posture and appearances. But here it was nothing more than theater. And then Anna appeared. The room shifted as if gravity had realigned itself. She floated past the rows of guests in a gown that seemed to drink in the light and scatter it back in 100 silken folds. Her makeup was soft, her hair a cascade of pinned curls, her smile bright enough to silence conversation. She looked like a painting, like every magazine bride Rachel had ever seen on newsstands. Rachel's heart clenched. For one flicker of a second, Anna's gaze swept across the alcove where Rachel sat. Their eyes met. But Anna did not stop, did not smile, did not acknowledge her. Her gaze slid over Rachel as though she were a stranger sitting in the wrong row. The forgotten sister remained invisible, reduced to a shadow at the edge of the celebration, watching the life she was denied unfold without her. The chatter of the guests rose and fell like waves, a polished rhythm of laughter, clinking glasses, and carefully chosen compliments. Rachel sat motionless, her back pressed against the hard chair near the exit, trying to blend into the wallpaper. Years in the field had taught her invisibility, not just physical but emotional. It was a skill she hadn't expected to need at her sister's wedding. But then she felt it, the subtle shift in air, the uncanny awareness of being watched. Her eyes swept the ballroom with deliberate casualness. She caught it near the center aisle. A man seated alone, one elbow resting on his knee. His head tilted slightly in her direction. His suit was muted gray, perfectly tailored, but his posture wasn't that of a guest enjoying champagne and small talk. His eyes weren't on the bride, nor the groom, nor the elegant floral displays. They were locked on her. Rachel held his gaze for the briefest of moments. A flicker passed across his expression. Not recognition exactly, but something sharper, as if he had just seen a ghost. Then, with deliberate precision, he looked away, blending back into the crowd so seamlessly that another person might have thought she imagined it. He didn't belong here. She knew it in the same way she once knew the weight of a rifle in her hands without looking, or the sound of danger in a silent room. This wasn't a friend of the groom or a distant cousin from her mother's side. This was someone else. Someone from a world she thought she'd left behind. Her pulse steadied, not fear but focus. If her instincts were right, then her sister's wedding wasn't just a family betrayal. It was a stage. And the wrong audience had already taken their seats. The reception unfurled like choreography. Laughter rose on cue. Glasses chimed with perfect timing. The quartet in the corner played a melody so polished it might have been rehearsed for weeks. Everything was beautiful. Too beautiful. Rachel's instincts stirred uneasily. Beauty in her world was rarely innocent. It was camouflage. Her eyes roamed the room, not in sweeping arcs but in deliberate fragments, trained to notice what didn't fit. And there it was, a waiter gliding between clusters of guests, balancing a tray of rosemary crackers and pear slices. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Black uniform, polished shoes, white gloves. But Rachel's gaze caught on the details, the crease in his left cuff, just slightly uneven. The name clipped to his waistcoat, Turner. She had overheard the catering manager earlier, rattling off staff names to a colleague. There had been no Turner. Most people would have missed it. But Rachel Carter had lived too long in shadows to overlook such mistakes. Her spine stiffened. She followed his movements subtly, noting how he lingered longer near the AV table, how his eyes didn't track guests with the ease of service staff but scanned the room in calculated patterns. And then the wider room itself came into sharper focus for her, the lighting rigs overhead too symmetrical, almost staged. The floral centerpieces lined up with military precision. The laughter around her rang rehearsed, like actors reciting lines instead of family celebrating love. It felt less like a wedding reception and more like a set. Rachel's fingers tightened on the slim clutch resting across her lap. Something was wrong here, terribly wrong. And if her instincts were right, the wedding wasn't just hiding her. It was hiding something much larger. Rachel adjusted her position, scanning the room again. The waiter with the wrong badge had disappeared into the kitchen corridor, leaving her with a tight coil of suspicion she couldn't ignore. She let her eyes drift, methodical, never rushed, tracking the patterns of the crowd. And then she saw him. By the marble column near the bar, a man stood alone, a glass of amber liquid in his hand that he never sipped. His suit was perfect. His tie loosened just enough to pass as casual. His hair, darker now than she remembered, caught the light when he shifted. Thomas Adler. The sight of him knocked the air from her lungs, not out of fear but memory. They had trained together, bled together, once trusted each other in places where trust meant survival. Years had passed since she'd last seen him. Years since she'd been stripped of her command and buried under redacted reports. Yet here he was, dressed like a wedding guest, watching the room with the same wary intensity she felt in her own bones. He caught her gaze. For a fraction of a second, his expression softened, a flicker of recognition in a sea of strangers. Then he moved, weaving through the crowd with unhurried ease, stopping at the charcuterie board as if he had nothing more on his mind than figs and soft cheese. "It's still you under the braid, right?" he murmured without looking at her. Rachel's lips curved into the barest trace of a smile. "Thomas." He set down his glass, lowered his voice. "Cross signals everywhere. The AV racks in the back room, they've been tampered with." Her shoulders stiffened. "By who?" "Someone who knows the language." He glanced at her then, finally meeting her eyes. His expression was sharp, professional. "They're not transmitting, Rachel. They're receiving." The words sank like lead. She felt the familiar pull of focus, the shift in her chest from unease to controlled readiness. If the estate systems were compromised, then this wasn't just a wedding. It was an operation, and she was already inside it. Rachel moved through the edges of the reception like smoke, present but unseen. Her clutch felt heavier now, the small scanner hidden inside its lining pressed against her palm like a heartbeat. She drifted toward the audio setup near the stage, where a technician in a gray polo was adjusting sound levels. At that moment, another waiter approached him, different from the rest. He passed over a USB drive as casually as if it were a cocktail napkin. Rachel's pulse sharpened. The technician plugged it in, and the waiter vanished into the corridor without a word. She timed her steps to the rhythm of the music, each movement calculated. At the microphone stand, she crouched slightly, thumbing open the scanner disguised as a lipstick tube. A silent pulse of light swept over the equipment. The screen flickered. Unauthorized relay detected. Rachel's chest tightened. This wasn't ordinary interference. It was military-grade encryption, frequencies she hadn't seen since Cyprus years ago. The patterns on her scanner looked sloppy at first glance, but the sloppiness was deliberate, a familiar mimicry of Department of Defense relay systems. She knew that signature. Her pulse slowed into something sharper than adrenaline. It wasn't panic. It was recognition. A ghost she had spent years trying to bury had just stepped back into her life. Marcus Reed. The name hit like shrapnel. He had been her commanding officer, her superior, the man who had stood in the ops van barking orders while she dragged dying soldiers out of rubble. He was also the man who had twisted the after-action report to bury her commendation, branding her a reckless liability instead of a leader. His lies had cost her her career, and nearly her identity. And now, in the middle of her sister's wedding, his fingerprints were here again. Rachel straightened slowly, tucking the scanner back into her clutch. Around her, the music swelled, guests clinked glasses, and Anna posed for photographs under strings of fairy lights. They had no idea that beneath the surface of their perfect celebration, an old war was unfolding again. And Marcus Reed was still pulling the strings. The bridal suite was too quiet. Candles flickered along the vanity, their glow soft against mirrors framed in gold. Lace veils and silk ribbons lay scattered like casualties after a storm. Rachel slipped inside without knocking, the door closing behind her with a click that sounded like a trigger being pulled. Anna stood in front of the full-length mirror, her gown a river of ivory spilling across the floor. She turned slightly, adjusting the strap on her shoulder, her hands steady at first, but Rachel saw the tremor beneath the practiced poise. "You're not supposed to be in here," Anna said sharply, her voice brittle, her reflection meeting Rachel's eyes through the mirror. "You weren't supposed to be broadcasting classified intel through your dress," Rachel answered evenly. Anna froze. Color drained from her face. "What are you talking about?" Rachel stepped closer, her tone flat, soldier's calm. "I already traced the signal. It's sewn into the hemline. Military-grade transmitter. Whoever fitted this gown gave you more than silk and lace." Anna's mouth opened, then closed. She shook her head, denial fighting with fear. I didn't know." Rachel studied her. The panic was real. For the first time since the morning, Anna didn't look like a bride glowing for the cameras. She looked like a younger sister caught in a fire she didn't start. "Then tell me where it came from." Anna swallowed hard. "The dress wasn't mine. It was a gift. From one of Matt's donors at the firm. He said it was part of a sponsorship, something exclusive. The designer called it custom. It was beautiful. I didn't think to question it." Rachel crouched, careful not to touch the silk with bare hands. She lifted the hem slightly and found it, the faint metallic thread sewn into the lining, clever enough to blend into the folds. She brushed her scanner along the seam. A faint pulse vibrated against her fingers. Active. Anna sank onto the velvet ottoman, her hands shaking now. "I didn't tell you because I thought you'd ruin everything." "But," her voice cracked, "you were right. Something's wrong with it, isn't there?" Rachel held up the tiny transmitter, its metallic sheen glinting in the candlelight like a cursed jewel. "Yes," she said. "But it's not you thereafter." Anna's eyes flicked from the torn hem to the transmitter glittering in Rachel's palm. For a moment she looked like the girl Rachel remembered, wide-eyed, vulnerable, clinging to her older sister after nightmares. But the moment passed, and anger surged in its place. "You always do this," Anna hissed, rising from the ottoman. Her gown rustled like a storm around her ankles. "You show up and destroy things. Every time. You can't just let me have one day, Rachel. One single day without you turning it into one of your missions." Rachel's jaw tightened. She wanted to lash back, to remind Anna that it wasn't her fault their family had cut ties, that she hadn't asked to be erased from birthdays and holidays. But she bit down on the words. Instead, she held up the device between two fingers. "This," Rachel said flatly, "isn't about me. It's about the people who put you in that dress. They used you. They turned your wedding into a cover operation." Anna's lip trembled, though she fought to keep her expression hard. "Why should I believe you? You're not even part of this family anymore. You left." "I was pushed out," Rachel shot back. "There's a difference." Her voice softened, but only slightly. "And I'm telling you, Anna, you're bait. Whether you like it or not." The words seemed to hollow the room. For the first time, Anna's mask cracked. She backed up a step, her spine brushing the vanity. Her reflection in the mirror looked pale, fragile. "They used me," she whispered. Rachel crouched again, exposing the seam she had cut. "Every step you took down that aisle, every word you spoke into a microphone, it's been monitored, transmitted. You were carrying their signal without even knowing it." Anna's hands dropped helplessly to her sides. The defiance drained from her posture, leaving only fear. "I thought I was being paranoid," she said, her voice breaking. "All morning I felt like eyes were on me. I told Matt." He laughed. "He said it was just nerves." Rachel pocketed the transmitter and straightened, meeting her sister's eyes. "It wasn't nerves." For a long beat, the only sound was the faint ticking of the antique clock on the wall. Two sisters, bound by blood yet standing worlds apart, one dressed for war, the other for a wedding that had already been corrupted. Rachel took a steadying breath. "Listen to me. I don't care what our parents think. I don't care that you've tried to cut me out. I'm not here to ruin you, Anna. I'm here to stop the people who would." Anna didn't answer. But she no longer looked at Rachel like an intruder. She looked at her like someone she might need to survive. The guests shuffled into the ballroom with murmurs of awe, their voices echoing beneath high ceilings and golden chandeliers. The air smelled faintly of roses and champagne, the music from the quartet soft enough to soothe but grand enough to impress. Rachel moved with the tide of strangers, slipping into her seat near the back, close to the exit, far from the spotlight. From here, she could see everything. Her mother guiding Anna to the front row with proud precision, her father puffed with patriarchal importance, the groom's family glowing with practiced smiles. Rachel sat in shadows, just another name checked off the list, forgotten before she even arrived. The ceremony began, the officiant's words polished and warm. Anna glided down the aisle on their father's arm, the transmitter gone from her gown now but her beauty still flawless, unmarred. Guests sighed, phones lifted discreetly, the moment captured for glossy perfection. Rachel kept her hands folded, eyes sharp, mind elsewhere. She was listening, not to the vows, but to the quiet hum of signals still pulsing faintly through the estate. The interference hadn't stopped. Removing the transmitter had only revealed the surface of something larger. Then the officiant paused, smiling at the crowd. "Before we begin this union," he said, "we'd like to take a moment to recognize those who have served. If there are any veterans present, you may stand now." There was a rustle of movement as a few older men rose politely from their seats, adjusting medals on their jackets. But then, from 3 rows ahead, another figure stood, Thomas Adler. His suit was immaculate. His tie loosened just enough to pass for civilian. But when he turned deliberately, his gaze locked on Rachel. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand to his brow. Full military salute. The air shifted. Conversations died mid-whisper. The music faltered. Guests turned in confusion, wondering why the stranger's gesture carried such weight. And then Thomas spoke, his voice steady, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. "Major General Rachel Carter, ma'am." The world froze. Rachel's breath caught, not out of surprise but out of recognition, the kind that stripped her of invisibility in a single stroke. Dozens of eyes turned toward her, faces twisting from confusion to dawning comprehension. Phones lowered. Glasses paused midair. Her mother's expression shattered, a locked drawer in her mind forced open. Her father looked as though he'd been struck. And Anna, finally Anna, looked directly at her. For the first time all day, Rachel Carter was not erased. She was seen. And she was seen for who she truly was. The applause after the salute faded into a brittle hush. Guests glanced uneasily between the glowing projector screen and Rachel, still standing tall in the aisle. The ceremony had fractured, its polished script unraveling thread by thread. And then she felt it, a gaze steady and deliberate. Rachel turned her head, and there he was, Marcus Reed. He sat in the second row, his posture immaculate, his suit dark enough to blend with the shadows but not enough to hide the arrogance in his smile. His hands rested lightly on the back of the chair in front of him, fingers drumming once, twice, like a man keeping time to a song only he could hear. When their eyes locked, his expression didn't falter. He didn't feign surprise at Thomas's salute. He didn't scramble to mask recognition. Instead, he smirked as if to say, "Finally, you're standing where I want you." The room tilted for Rachel. She knew that expression. It was the same look he'd given her on the tarmac in Aleppo, the same curve of his mouth when he signed her career away with a single falsified report. Confidence carved into cruelty. But this time it was different. Because Thomas's salute had dragged her out of the shadows. She was no longer the ghost sister, no longer the erased officer. Her family's eyes were on her. The guests' phones were recording. She wasn't invisible anymore. And Reed knew it. The smirk deepened, his chin lifting slightly, as though daring her to speak, daring her to step into his arena. Around them, laughter and whispers faltered, a brittle tension stretching thin across the gilded room. Rachel's hands curled into fists at her sides. For the first time in years, Marcus Reed wasn't an untouchable specter hidden behind redacted files. He was flesh and blood, sitting in the second row of her sister's wedding, smug and certain. But certainty, she reminded herself, was the first crack in any enemy's armor. The balance had shifted. And this time she would not let him write the ending. The lounge was dim, a pocket of stillness carved out from the noise of the reception. Heavy velvet drapes muffled the music from the ballroom, and the scent of rosewood candles clung to the air. Rachel sat alone in a leather chair, her hands pressed against the edges of a small velvet box Thomas had slipped her earlier. She hadn't opened it yet. She didn't need to. She knew what waited inside. Memories pressed in before she could stop them. Syria 2016. The dust had been everywhere. Red, choking, clinging to skin and gear. Her comms crackled with static as she barked orders over the chaos, trying to move her team through fractured buildings that shifted under every step. Civilians had been trapped, their voices echoing faintly through the rubble. A boy crying, a woman calling for her husband. Reed's voice had come through the uplink, cool and detached. Hold perimeter. Wait for secondary drone clearance. Rachel had gritted her teeth, scanning the collapse. We don't have time. They won't last 5 minutes in there. That's an order, Carter. Hold. But she hadn't held. She couldn't. Thomas had already been bleeding from a shrapnel wound, 2 others pinned under concrete, their breaths shallow. She had taken command, cut the feed, and led her unit in. 12 minutes of hell. Dragging, lifting, pulling bodies free while the walls threatened to bury them alive. When the dust cleared, they had saved everyone. Barely. But in the after-action report, her choices were rewritten. Reed's fingerprints were all over it. Her override became reckless field improvisation. Her heroism became insubordination under fire. Reed's voice had vanished from the official comms log as if it had never existed. Her commendation was buried. His promotion arrived 3 weeks later. Now, in the quiet lounge of a wedding built on lies, Rachel could still feel the grit of Syrian sand in her lungs, the weight of Thomas's blood on her gloves, the bitterness of being erased not just from her family, but from history. She clenched her fists, forcing the memories back into the dark where they had lived for years. But Marcus Reed had resurfaced, and with him, the ghosts of a war he had tried to bury her in. And this time Rachel vowed he would not walk away clean. Thomas slipped into the lounge without a word, his eyes sweeping the corners before he closed the door behind him. In his hand was a phone, secure, black, stripped of logos. He handed it to Rachel. "The transmitter you pulled from the gown," he said quietly. I ran a full decrypt. Rachel took the device, her thumb brushing across the screen. Strings of code cascaded down, flickering with metadata headers and timestamps. At first glance, it was just noise. But Rachel had seen this architecture before. She felt her stomach tighten as she traced the patterns. Jesus, she whispered. The data wasn't just transmitting. It was rewriting. Logs, mission files, entire chains of command, altered line by line, rewritten to shift blame. One tag in particular repeated over and over. Directive 19A, Officer RC, unauthorized engagement. Failure to confirm secondary evac protocol. Civilian risk exposure. Her initials. Her name stripped to letters. Her throat went dry. He's rewriting my history. Thomas leaned against the wall, his jaw hard. Not just yours. He's framing you as the reckless one, the liability. And in doing that, he keeps his record spotless. He turns your command into his shield. Rachel scrolled deeper, her pulse quickening. The logs weren't static. They were updating live, fed into a proxy network bouncing through encrypted nodes. She recognized some of the signatures. Political, congressional, high-level oversight committees. This wasn't just about smearing her. This was about cementing Reed's version of events into the permanent record. Her commendation buried. His lies immortalized. History is being rewritten in real time, Rachel said, her voice low, controlled. And if he finishes this upload, there'll be no trace I ever saved those civilians. No proof he left them to die. To the world, I'll just be the officer who went rogue. Thomas's eyes narrowed. Then we stopped the rewrite. Rachel closed the phone slowly, her reflection catching in the darkened window. Outside, laughter swelled as champagne flutes clinked, the wedding guests oblivious to the war raging in their midst. Inside, Rachel Carter understood something with bone-deep clarity. She wasn't just fighting for her reputation. She was fighting for the truth itself. And Marcus Reed had just made the mistake of trying to erase the wrong soldier. The ballroom glittered like a magazine spread. Hundreds of candles reflecting in the glassware, chandeliers dimmed to a soft gold, every detail curated for elegance. The air was thick with perfume and champagne, heavy enough to disguise the tension humming beneath the surface. Rachel sat at the edge of the room, her clutch resting on her lap, her eyes never leaving the man at the center. Marcus Reed. He stood with a glass in hand, the image of charm and authority, his smile polished, his presence magnetic. To the guests, he was a family friend, a mentor to the groom, a dignified veteran with the kind of gravitas money couldn't buy. But to Rachel, he was a predator in silk. He lifted his glass, the murmur of conversation softening instantly. A toast, he began, his voice smooth as velvet. Not only to the happy couple, who shine tonight brighter than these chandeliers, but to the families who raised them. The Carters, the Halperns, names that stand for loyalty, honor, and quiet strength. Applause rippled. Rachel's mother dabbed at her eyes. Her father nodded solemnly, soaking in Reed's borrowed words. And lastly, Reed continued, his gaze sweeping the crowd, to those who serve in silence, the guardians in the shadows. May we always honor them, and may we deserve their silence. The line landed like poetry, disguised reverence masking a blade. Guests clapped louder. Margaret Carter beamed, pride swelling in her posture. Rachel's fingers tightened around the transmitter hidden in her clutch. Thomas caught her eye across the room and gave the subtlest nod. She tapped the device once. The lights flickered. The slideshow of wedding photos dissolved. Confused murmurs rippled through the room as the screen behind Reed blinked twice, then came alive with a wash of static. And then not photographs of Anna and Matt. Not smiling family portraits. Combat footage. The screen glowed with night vision green, rubble collapsing in real time, the screams of civilians carried through the speakers. Rachel's own voice barked orders clear and urgent. Team Alpha, move now. Civilian priority. Another voice cut in. Reads. Negative. Hold position. No evac until confirmation. Gasps erupted through the crowd. Guests froze, their champagne glasses trembling in midair. The polished illusion of the wedding shattered in a single heartbeat. On the screen, the truth played out. The children huddled in corners, soldiers bleeding, Rachel hauling bodies through dust while Reed's orders delayed their rescue. The lies he'd buried dragged into the light. Reed's smile faltered. For the first time that evening, his mask slipped. He turned sharply toward the projector, his voice rising in perfect imitation of outrage. This isn't part of the program. Someone's hacked the system. This is classified. But no one was listening to him anymore. They were all staring at the screen. And then at Rachel. The ballroom was silent except for the flickering audio spilling from the projector. Night vision footage painted the walls in ghostly green, broken only by the sound of Rachel's voice overriding Reed's orders. Children's cries, the grind of collapsing stone, the frantic scramble of soldiers. It was all there, undeniable. Rachel rose from her seat at the back, every step toward the aisle ringing out against the marble like a hammer. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She walked the way she had walked through ruined cities before, deliberate and unflinching, as though the entire room had become a battlefield. This, she said, her voice clear and steady, is the truth you were never meant to see. Dozens of heads snapped toward her. Her mother's hand froze against her pearls. Her father's mouth opened, then closed. Anna, standing near the dais, looked as though the ground had tilted beneath her feet. Rachel kept her eyes locked on Reed. You left civilians to die. You buried the evidence. And when I disobeyed to save them, you made sure the record erased me instead of your failure. Reed's expression was flawless, a portrait of indignation. This is absurd, he barked, his tone measured to sound commanding rather than defensive. Fabricated footage, spliced audio. A personal vendetta paraded on a wedding day. You should all be disgusted. Enough. The voice came from the back row. A man in a tuxedo stood slowly, his press badge glinting faintly in the candlelight. Rachel's breath caught. Derek Shaw. She hadn't seen him in years. Not since Istanbul, when he'd disappeared from the circuit entirely. Now he raised his phone, live stream already running, the red light glowing like a flare in the dark. I was there, Derek said, his voice carrying across the stunned crowd. That's me, 10 seconds from the right, hauling a child out of that building. I watched Rachel Carter override Reed's order and save every civilian in that warehouse. If she hadn't acted, we'd all be dead. Reed's voice, he pointed to the projector, was the one that delayed us. Not hers. The room exploded. Guests shouted, phones rose into the air, streams and recordings capturing every second. Reporters in disguise surged forward. The carefully curated illusion of the wedding unraveled into chaos. For the first time, Reed's mask cracked. His jaw tightened. His eyes darted toward the exits, his hand clenching so tightly around his glass it trembled. Rachel didn't move. She stood in the aisle, her boots planted firm on polished marble, and let the storm break around her. Marcus Reed had spent years erasing her. Tonight she had dragged him into the light. The ballroom had dissolved into chaos. Guests surged toward the screen, some shouting, some filming, others simply frozen in disbelief. The footage looped again, relentless. Rachel's voice overriding orders, Reed's commands delaying rescue, the faces of civilians carried through dust and fire. Reed raised his hands, trying to command the room. This is propaganda, he thundered. You're watching a forgery, AI-generated, a deepfake. Do not be deceived. But his voice cracked at the edges, the polish stripped away. He looked smaller now, the predator's aura bleeding into desperation. Then the doors opened. 2 men in dark suits entered with calm authority, their presence cutting through the chaos like a blade. They moved with the unmistakable precision of federal agents. One reached into his jacket and unfolded a document, his voice clear and sharp enough to still the noise. "Marcus Reed," he announced. "You are under federal investigation for obstruction of justice, falsification of national defense intelligence, and endangerment of civilian lives." Gasps rippled. Cameras swung. Phones flashed. Reed's face contorted, outrage fighting with fear. "This is a mistake," he spat. "You don't know what you're doing." But the agents were already on him. One twisted his arm behind his back with practiced efficiency, the snap of handcuffs loud in the charged silence. Reed flinched, his veneer of control shattering completely. Rachel didn't move. She watched as the man who had buried her career, who had turned her into a ghost, was marched out of the room like a criminal. And then, her father's eyes found hers. For years, Arthur Carter had barely looked at her, choosing polite nods or distant silence over acknowledgement. But now, in the glow of the chandeliers and the storm of revelation, his gaze held hers directly. His expression was unreadable, shock, maybe guilt, maybe pride, but it was real. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking through her. He was seeing her. Rachel held his gaze for a long moment, then gave the smallest nod. It was not forgiveness. Not yet. But it was something neither of them had dared before. Recognition. And that was enough. The ballroom was quieter now, the chaos ebbing like a tide that had pulled back to reveal wreckage beneath. Guests whispered in clusters, phones still glowing with the footage that had already spread beyond the estate. The chandeliers glimmered as though nothing had happened, but the air carried the heavy hush of a room forever changed. Near the floral arch, the photographer stood awkwardly, camera hanging limp at her side. She cleared her throat, her voice uncertain. "Would you like the family portraits now?" For a moment no one moved. Margaret Carter fussed with her pearls. Arthur busied himself with straightening his jacket. It was Anna who finally broke the silence. "Yes," she said firmly. Her voice carried a strength Rachel hadn't heard in years. "But all of us. Together." Her gaze swept the room until it landed on Rachel. Guests shifted, watching. Rachel felt the familiar urge to step back, to fade into the margins where she'd been pushed so many times before. But then Anna extended her hand. Not politely, not as an afterthought, but pointedly. "Next to me," Anna said. The words cracked something open inside Rachel. Slowly, she crossed the aisle, her boots echoing against the marble. She took her place beside her sister, the bride still glowing in her gown, her bouquet clutched in one hand. Their parents shifted in closer, hesitant but present. For the first time in years they stood together, imperfect, strained, but whole in a way Rachel had thought lost forever. The camera clicked, capturing the four of them in a frame no one had expected. Not erased, not invisible. Rachel was there. As the photographer adjusted her lens for another shot, Anna leaned in, her voice a whisper only Rachel could hear. "Thank you," she murmured, her breath warm against Rachel's ear. "For not letting me marry into a lie." Rachel blinked, her throat tightening. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The camera clicked again, sealing the moment not as performance, but as truth. For the first time, Rachel Carter stood in the center of her family. Not a ghost, not a shadow, but a sister. Weeks later, the world looked different. Not quieter. Rachel knew better than to expect that, but clearer. The headlines had burned through their cycle. The footage from the wedding had been dissected on news panels. And Marcus Reed's name now carried the weight of scandal rather than power. But today wasn't about Reed. It was about truth. The rotunda of the National Memorial glowed with late-morning light, golden rays spilling across curved walls lined with brass nameplates. The air was solemn, reverent. Soldiers in dress blues filled the front rows, civilians behind them, and scattered throughout the crowd were fragments of Rachel's past. Faces she hadn't seen in years, operatives she once thought gone forever. Rachel stood at the podium, palms flat against the wood, grounding herself. A flag hung at half-mast behind her. No spectacle, no banners. Only the weight of silence waiting to be broken. "I never needed my name in a report," she began, her voice calm but carrying. "What I needed was for the people we saved to live. 4 years I stayed silent. Not because I was afraid, but because I believed the work demanded it. But silence can protect lies as easily as it protects lives. She paused, scanning the crowd. Eyes leaned forward, listening. In the second row, Anna held her phone high, recording for her podcast, her expression proud. Beside her, Thomas stood at ease, his hands clasped, steady as ever. Rachel reached into her blazer and drew out a medal. Real, burnished silver with a crimson edge. Not the replica they once offered her as a consolation, but the original she had earned in Syria and been denied. They told me Operation Vanguard never existed, she said, her gaze fixed on the audience. They told me my actions were reckless, my command erased, my story buried. But the truth has a weight. Wait. And today, it is finally written. She turned and gestured to the wall behind her. A bronze plaque gleamed, freshly unveiled, the name etched at its center unmovable now. Operation Vanguard. Black Horizon Division. Director Rachel Carter. For a heartbeat, the room was still. Then a young soldier in the front row rose slowly, his heels clicking together. He lifted his hand in a crisp salute. "Welcome home, Director." The words rippled outward like a tide. One by one, the audience rose. Soldiers, civilians, even those who had never served, until the entire rotunda stood, a quiet storm of applause and salutes. No fanfare. No trumpets. Just recognition. Rachel stepped down from the podium, the weight of years lifting with every step. Her name no longer buried, no longer erased. Finally written. Finally in ink.